There's a moment in every empath's life that changes everything. It's not dramatic. There's no explosion, no confrontation, no raised voices. It happens quietly, in the space between one breath and the next. It's the moment when something inside them finally breaks, not from weakness, but from carrying too much weight for too long. For years, maybe decades, the empath has been the emotional cushion for everyone around them. They've absorbed anger, deflected cruelty, and made excuses for behavior that should never be excused. They've poured themselves into people who only know how to take. They've silenced their own pain to make room for everyone else's comfort. And they've done it all while believing this is what love looks like. But resentment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or warning signs. It accumulates like dust in corners no one cleans, invisible until suddenly it's everywhere. The empath who once rushed to answer your calls now hesitates. The warmth that used to radiate from them feels muted, filtered through something heavy and cold. Their smile still appears, but it no longer reaches their eyes. This is when people start to panic. Because empaths aren't supposed to change. They're supposed to be endlessly available, perpetually understanding, infinitely forgiving. When that steady source of emotional labor begins to flicker, the people who've depended on it feel the ground shift beneath them. And they call it revenge. But here's what most people don't understand: an empath's resentment isn't about hurting you back. It's not about evening the score or making you feel the pain they felt. That would require them to become someone they're fundamentally not. Instead, their revenge is something far more profound and far more devastating to those who've taken them for granted. Their revenge is absence. Not the dramatic kind, where doors slam and bridges burn. Not the performative kind, where social media posts announce their liberation. The empath's revenge is the quiet withdrawal of their presence from your life. It's the space where their energy used to be, now filled with nothing but silence. It's the realization that you've been speaking to someone who's no longer really listening. When an empath turns resentful, they don't plot against you. They don't scheme about how to hurt you. They don't even think about you as much as you'd imagine. Because the truth is, their resentment forced them to finally do something they should have done years ago. They started thinking about themselves. This is the part that confuses people most. How can someone so attuned to others' emotions suddenly seem so distant? How can the person who always knew what you needed before you asked now appear completely indifferent to your struggles? The answer is simple but uncomfortable. They didn't stop caring because they became cruel. They stopped caring because survival demanded it. Resentment in an empath is like an immune response. It's the psyche's way of protecting itself from further infection. Every boundary they failed to set, every time they said yes when they meant no, every moment they prioritized someone else's comfort over their own well-being, it all created wounds that festered in the dark. Resentment is the fever that finally says, enough. What looks like coldness is actually clarity. What feels like punishment is actually self-preservation. The empath isn't withholding their love to hurt you. They're withholding it because they finally understand that some people don't know how to receive love without consuming the person offering it. And here's the revenge that no one sees coming. When an empath stops trying to fix you, stops trying to understand you, stops making themselves smaller to accommodate your ego, you're forced to face yourself without a buffer. There's no one left to blame for your emptiness. No one left to process your emotions for you. No one left to convince you that your behavior is acceptable when it isn't. The empath's resentment doesn't destroy you with malice. It destroys the version of reality where you were allowed to remain unconscious of your impact. It removes the safety net you didn't even know you were relying on. And suddenly, the emotional work they were doing invisibly becomes glaringly obvious in its absence. This is when the accusations start flying. The empath is called selfish, cold, different, changed. They're accused of abandoning people, of not being who they used to be, of becoming hard. And every single one of these accusations is actually a confession that the accuser had grown comfortable with an arrangement that was slowly killing the empath. But the empath who has reached the point of resentment isn't interested in defending themselves anymore. They're not interested in explaining why they need boundaries or justifying their right to protect their peace. They've spent too many years over-explaining, over-apologizing, overfunctioning in relationships where their needs were perpetually postponed. Their revenge isn't a weapon. It's a withdrawal. It's the reclamation of energy that was never meant to be given away so freely. It's the recognition that some people loved the service they provided more than they loved the person providing it. And perhaps most surprisingly, this revenge doesn't feel good to the empath. There's no satisfaction in it, no triumph, no sense of victory. There's only exhaustion and a deep, bone-tired sadness for all the years they spent believing that loving others meant destroying themselves. There's grief for the person they used to be, the one who believed everyone deserved endless chances, the one who thought their empathy could heal anyone who was hurting. The resentful empath has learned what few people understand, that empathy without boundaries is self-betrayal. That compassion without reciprocity is martyrdom. That you cannot save someone who's comfortable drowning, and you'll only drown yourself trying. This is just the beginning of understanding what happens when an empath's love curdles into resentment. Because what comes next isn't what anyone expects, not the empath themselves, and certainly not the people who took them for granted. The transformation doesn't happen overnight, but when it finally completes, it's absolute. The empath who emerges from the chrysalis of resentment is someone entirely different from the person who entered it. And the people who knew them before can't quite comprehend what they're witnessing. Because the resentful empath doesn't just withdraw, they rebuild. And they rebuild themselves into someone who would be unrecognizable to the version of themselves that tolerated disrespect in the name of understanding. Someone who can look at manipulation and call it exactly what it is, without softening the edges or making excuses for the manipulator. This is where their revenge becomes truly devastating to those who took advantage of their kindness. The empath develops immunity to the tactics that once controlled them. The guilt trips that used to work? They bounce off like rain on glass. The emotional manipulation that used to tie them in knots? They can now see it coming from miles away and simply step aside. The weaponized vulnerability that used to make them rush in to save someone? They now recognize it as the trap it always was. The narcissist, the user, the emotional vampire, they all relied on the empath's inability to say no, their compulsion to fix and heal, their desperate need to believe the best in everyone. But resentment burned away that naivety like fog under harsh sunlight. What remains is someone who can witness suffering without automatically assuming responsibility for ending it. And this is what terrifies the people who benefited from the old version of the empath. Because an empath who has learned to say that's not my problem is an empath who can no longer be controlled. The revenge intensifies in its quietness. The empath doesn't need to expose anyone's wrongdoing publicly. They don't need to tell everyone how they were mistreated. They don't need to warn others about the people who hurt them. They simply step back and let those people reveal themselves naturally, without the empath there to clean up their messes, translate their cruelty into misunderstanding, or provide cover for their dysfunction. Watch what happens when an empath stops managing someone's reputation for them. Watch what happens when they stop being the buffer between a difficult person and the consequences of their behavior. Watch what happens when they stop explaining that they didn't mean it that way or they're going through a hard time, or if you really knew them, you'd understand. Without the empath's protective translation services, toxic people suddenly find themselves standing naked in their own truth. Their patterns become visible. Their cycles become predictable. Their emptiness becomes obvious. And they have no one to blame but themselves, though they'll certainly try to blame the empath anyway. But here's the beauty of the resentful empath's revenge. They're no longer listening to those accusations. They're not defending themselves, not explaining themselves, not justifying their boundaries. They've finally understood that people who are determined to misunderstand you will never be convinced otherwise, no matter how clearly you explain yourself. So they stop explaining. And in that silence, in that refusal to engage, they reclaim a power they never knew they had. The resentful empath discovers something profound, that their empathy was only ever meant to be a gift, never an obligation. That they can choose who receives it. That they can withdraw it from people who weaponize it. That saying I don't care anymore isn't cruelty, it's liberation. This is when the real shift happens. The empath stops performing emotional labor for people who never appreciated it. They stop answering late-night crisis calls from people who ignore them during the day. They stop giving advice that's never taken. They stop offering support to people who only reach out when they need something. And the people who depended on that free, unlimited emotional resource? They spiral. Because they never develop their own emotional regulation skills. They never learn how to sit with discomfort. They never build genuine connections with others because the empath was always there to fill every void. The empath's absence creates a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Suddenly, the taker has to take responsibility for their own emotional state. The narcissist has to find a new supply. The drama seeker has to find a new audience. And none of them can, because the empath was the only one willing to play those roles for so long. This is the revenge nobody talks about. The natural consequences that finally catch up to people when there's no empath around to shield them. The loneliness that sets in when you realize nobody actually wants to be around you when you're not getting something from them. The emptiness that echoes when there's no one left to fill it for you. The resentful empath doesn't cause this pain. They simply stop preventing it. They stop being the shock absorber between toxic people and reality. And reality, as it turns out, has no patience for people who refuse to grow. Meanwhile, something unexpected happens to the empath. As they withdraw their energy from people who drain them, they discover they have energy left over. Energy for themselves. Energy for dreams they'd buried. Energy for people who actually reciprocate care and respect. Energy for joy, for peace, for stillness. They start sleeping better. Their anxiety decreases. Their intuition sharpens. They laugh more freely. They stop second-guessing every decision. They stop apologizing for taking up space. They stop shrinking themselves to make others comfortable. And this thriving, this blooming, this visible happiness, is the final twist of the revenge. Because the people who took them for granted have to watch the empath flourish in their absence. They have to witness someone they convinced was too sensitive, too emotional, too much, living a life full of genuine connection and peace. The empath's revenge isn't destruction. It's demonstration. It's proof that they were never the problem. It's evidence that their empathy wasn't a flaw that needed fixing. The relationships were flawed, and the empath's presence was just masking the rot. When an empath turns resentful, they don't become cruel. They become clear. They don't seek vengeance. They seek peace. And they find it in the last place anyone expected, in the space where toxic people used to be, now filled with nothing but possibility. The most dangerous thing about a resentful empath isn't their anger. It's their clarity. Because once they see the patterns, they can never unsee them. Once they recognize the game, they can never pretend it's not being played. And once they understand their own worth, they can never again accept being treated as worthless. This clarity becomes a mirror that reflects back every toxic dynamic with perfect accuracy. The empath who once absorbed blame now deflects it with surgical precision. The person who once accepted crumbs now recognizes a full table when they see one. The one who believed love meant sacrifice now understands that real love never asks you to betray yourself. And here's where the revenge gets personal for the narcissist. The empath stops seeing them as complex, misunderstood, or wounded. They see them as exactly what they are, someone who chose comfort over growth, supply over connection, power over partnership. The mystique dissolves. The excuses evaporate. What remains is just another person who refused to do their own healing work and expected someone else to carry the weight. This demystification is unbearable for people who rely on being seen as special, complicated, or damaged in interesting ways. The empath's resentment strips away all the elaborate narratives and reveals the simple truth: some people just don't want to be better. They want an audience for their dysfunction. The resentful empath stops being that audience. And without an audience, the performance loses its power. But the transformation goes deeper than just seeing through manipulation. The empath begins to recognize their own patterns too. They see how they used their empathy as a shield against their own pain. How they focused on everyone else's problems to avoid facing their own. How they played savior because being needed felt safer than being wanted. How they confused intensity with intimacy and chaos with passion. This self-awareness is uncomfortable. It means accepting that they participated in their own exploitation, that they taught people how to use them by never enforcing consequences, that their kindness sometimes enabled cruelty by making it cost-free, that their empathy, untempered by boundaries, became a weapon someone else wielded against them. The resentful empath has to grieve the role they played in their own suffering. And that grief is heavier than any anger they feel toward the people who hurt them. Because anger at others is easy. Accountability to yourself is brutal. But something alchemical happens in that brutality. The empath who can look at their own complicity without flinching becomes unshakable. They develop a spine made of self-respect. They learn that protecting your peace isn't selfish, it's sacred. They understand that not everyone deserves access to your heart, your time, your energy, or your empathy. This is when the empath becomes truly dangerous to toxic systems. Because they stop playing their assigned role. They refuse to be the emotional dumping ground, the free therapist, the crisis manager, the excuse maker, the reputation protector. They walk away from entire systems that were built on their silent suffering. Families implode when the empath stops being the peacekeeper. Friend groups dissolve when the empath stops being the glue. Workplaces struggle when the empath stops absorbing everyone's emotional overflow. Relationships end when the empath stops doing the emotional labor for two people. And everyone blames the empath for the collapse. Because it's easier to blame the person who stopped carrying the weight than to acknowledge the weight should never have been theirs to carry alone. But the resentful empath has learned something crucial. Other people's opinions of you are none of your business. Especially when those opinions come from people who benefited from your self-betrayal. The same people calling you selfish never called themselves selfish for taking endlessly. The same people calling you cold never called themselves cold for never offering warmth. The same people saying you've changed are really saying you've stopped letting them use you. The empath hears these accusations and feels nothing. Not because they've become heartless, but because they've finally learned the difference between guilt and manipulation. Guilt is what you feel when you've actually wronged someone. Manipulation is what someone makes you feel when you stop letting them wrong you. This discernment becomes the empath's superpower. They can now spot manipulation in real time and simply opt out. They can recognize love bombing and remain unmoved. They can hear a sob story and still say no. They can witness someone's pain and not make it their responsibility to fix it. This doesn't mean they've lost their empathy. It means they've gained wisdom. They still feel deeply. They still care about human suffering. But they've learned that you can't save someone who's drowning if they're determined to pull you under. They've learned that some people are addicted to their own victimhood and will resist every attempt to free them from it. They've learned that you can't heal someone who's using their wounds as weapons. The resentful empath redirects their empathy inward first. They become their own priority. They parent their inner child with the tenderness they gave everyone else. They speak to themselves with the compassion they extended so freely to people who mocked them for it. They protect their energy the way they once protected everyone else's feelings. And in doing so, they become whole. Not healed, because healing isn't linear and trauma doesn't disappear, but integrated. They accept their scars without letting those scars define them. They acknowledge their sensitivity without apologizing for it. They own their empathy without allowing it to be exploited. This integration is the final form of revenge. Because the empath who was supposed to be broken by all that betrayal, all that exploitation, all that emotional violence, they're not broken. They're rebuilt. Stronger, wiser, and absolutely uninterested in proving anything to anyone. They don't need vindication. They don't need apologies. They don't need acknowledgement of the harm done to them. They've given themselves all of those things. They've validated their own experience. They've apologized to themselves for allowing the mistreatment. They've acknowledged their own pain without needing anyone else to witness it. The resentful empath discovers that the best revenge isn't making someone regret losing you. It's genuinely not caring whether they regret it or not. It's building a life so full of authentic connection and joy that your abuser becomes a footnote in your story rather than the main plot. They become impossible to hoover back in. Impossible to guilt. Impossible to manipulate. Not because they've become hard, but because they've become whole. And wholeness has no space for people who require you to break yourself into pieces to accommodate them. This is the revenge nobody saw coming, the empath who not only survives but transforms into someone who wouldn't take you back even if you begged. The strangest part of the empath's transformation is how little they think about the people who hurt them. The narcissist assumes they're consumed with thoughts of revenge, replaying conversations, planning confrontations, building cases. But the truth is far more devastating. The empath has moved on so completely that their abuser barely crosses their mind anymore. This indifference is the ultimate insult to someone who thrived on being the center of attention, even negative attention. The narcissist would rather be hated than forgotten. But the resentful empath doesn't hate them. Hate requires emotional investment. The empath has withdrawn all investment. There's nothing left but a vague memory of someone they used to know, someone they used to be willing to destroy themselves for. When the toxic person tries to circle back, and they always do, they're met with something they can't comprehend: complete neutrality. Not anger. Not hurt. Not even curiosity. Just a flat, emotionless boundary that feels like speaking to a stranger. Because in every way that matters, they are strangers now. The empath who used to read their every micro-expression, who knew their patterns better than they knew themselves, who could anticipate their needs before they voiced them, that person no longer exists. The empath who replaced them doesn't care to understand you anymore. Doesn't care to decode your mixed signals. Doesn't care to excavate the childhood wound that made you this way. Doesn't care to find the good in you that everyone else missed. They've finally accepted that some people simply aren't their problem to solve. This acceptance births a kind of freedom that's intoxicating. The empath starts saying no without explanation. They cancel plans without guilt. They don't respond to messages that don't serve them. They block people without warning or ceremony. They delete entire chapters of their life without looking back. They treat their time, energy, and presence as the precious resources they always were. And the people who took those resources for granted suddenly realize they're locked out. The door that was always open is now shut. The light that always welcomed them is dark. The empath who always answered is unreachable. And no amount of crisis, no performance of need, no manipulation tactic can get that door to open again. Because the resentful empath has learned the most important lesson: you can't selectively numb emotions. When you shut down your ability to feel pain, you also shut down your ability to feel joy. The empaths spent years numbing themselves to survive toxic relationships. They swallowed their anger, suppressed their needs, silenced their intuition. And in doing so, they became a muted version of themselves. But resentment cracked that numbness open. And once the pain came flooding back, so did everything else. The rage they'd been swallowing. The grief they'd been postponing. The shame they'd been carrying. The fear they'd been ignoring. It all surfaced at once, overwhelming and impossible to contain. This emotional reckoning is where most people break. But the empath doesn't break, they break open. And what pours out isn't pretty. It's messy and raw and sometimes frightening in its intensity. The empath who never raised their voice starts screaming. The one who always made peace starts burning bridges. The one who forgave everything becomes ruthlessly unforgiving. This phase terrifies everyone, including the empath themselves. Because they've never allowed themselves to be this angry, this unreasonable, this selfish. They've spent their whole life being the reasonable one, the understanding one, the bigger person. And now they're done being bigger. They want to be petty. They want to be cold. They want to return every ounce of energy they gave and receive nothing in return. But here's what happens that nobody predicts. The empath realizes that being petty doesn't feel good. Being cold doesn't heal the wounds. Returning cruelty doesn't balance the scales. Because the empath's nature hasn't fundamentally changed. They're still wired for connection, for depth, for meaning. They just needed to purge the poison before they could access those parts of themselves again. So the rage passes? Not because they've forgiven anyone, but because they've finally forgiven themselves. They've stopped punishing themselves for being too trusting, too giving, too naive. They've accepted that their empathy wasn't weakness. It was just offered to the wrong people. They've recognized that being betrayed doesn't mean you were stupid for trusting. It means someone else was broken enough to betray trust. This self-forgiveness is the soil where the new empath takes root. Not the old version who gave indiscriminately. Not the resentful version who gave nothing. But a third version who gives selectively, intentionally, to people who've earned it through consistent action rather than convincing words. This new empath has standards that would have seemed cruel to their former self. They require reciprocity. They demand respect. They expect effort. They walk away at the first red flag instead of painting it green in their mind. They trust patterns over potential. They believe actions over apologies. And most importantly, they've stopped seeing their empathy as something that makes them special and started seeing it as something that makes them vulnerable. Not in a shameful way, but in a way that requires protection. They guard their empathy the way you'd guard any precious resource, by ensuring it's not wasted on people who can't appreciate its value. The toxic people in their old life can't understand this shift. They see it as the empath becoming judgmental, harsh, unforgiving. They say things like you used to be so kind or you've lost your spark or success changed you. But what they really mean is, you used to let me treat you poorly, and now you don't, and I don't like it. The resentful empath hears these complaints and feels something unexpected, pride. Because yes, they have changed. Yes, they're different. Yes, they're harder to access. And every single one of those changes was hard-won through pain they never should have had to endure. They're not ashamed of their boundaries. They're proud of them. Each one represents a lesson learned, a limit discovered, a line drawn in permanent ink. This is the part of the revenge that feels good, becoming someone you're proud of. Building a life that reflects your values. Surrounding yourself with people who add to your peace instead of subtracting from it. Waking up without dread. Going to bed without replaying conversations. Living without constantly monitoring someone else's mood to ensure your safety. The empath's revenge isn't about making anyone suffer. It's about refusing to suffer anymore. And that refusal, that simple boundary between their well-being and everyone else's comfort, is more powerful than any punishment they could devise. The final stage of the empath's transformation isn't what anyone expects, least of all the empath themselves. Because after the withdrawal, after the rage, after the boundaries, after the pride in their newfound strength, something softer emerges. Not softness in the way they used to be soft, pliable and easily shaped by other people's needs. But a different kind of softness. One that comes from strength rather than fear. The resentful empath eventually stops being resentful. Not because they've forgiven the unforgivable or forgotten the unforgettable, but because carrying resentment requires energy, and they've finally learned that their energy is finite and precious. Resentment kept them safe for a while, kept them vigilant, kept them from falling back into old patterns. But it was never meant to be permanent. It was a bridge between who they were and who they're becoming. And who they're becoming is someone who can hold space for complexity. Someone who understands that hurt people, without using that understanding as permission to be hurt again. Someone who can acknowledge that the people who damaged them were probably damaged themselves, without making that their responsibility to fix. Someone who can feel compassion for those who wronged them from a distance so vast that compassion can exist without contact. This is the part that confuses everyone. The people who watch the empath build walls assume those walls are permanent. The people who witness the coldness assume it's who the empath has become. But the empath was never building a fortress. They were building a filter. And now that the filter is in place, they can afford to be warm again. Just not with everyone. Not automatically. Not as a default setting that anyone can access. The revenge reaches its final form here. The empath becomes the kind of person their former self needed. They show up for people who are struggling the way no one showed up for them. They offer the grace they were denied. They create the safe spaces they desperately searched for and never found. But they do it with discernment now. They do it for people who are genuinely trying to heal, not people who are weaponizing their wounds. They do it for people who take responsibility, not people who take hostages. And here's the beautiful irony. The toxic people who accuse the empath of being selfish, cold, and changed get to watch from outside the circle as the empath pours love and support into others. They get to see that the empath didn't lose their capacity for empathy. They just lost their capacity to waste it on people who treated it like garbage. The narcissist sees the empath being patient with someone else and thinks, "They were never that patient with me." The user sees the empath being generous with someone else and thinks, "They were never that generous with me." The emotional vampire sees the empath being available for someone else and thinks, "They were never that available for me." And they're right. But not for the reasons they think. The empath wasn't those things with them because they were too busy defending themselves, walking on eggshells, managing chaos, and trying to earn love that should have been freely given. The empath wasn't those things because you can't pour from an empty cup, and those people drained every drop and then complained about the quality of the pour. The people who receive the empath's energy now are people who protect it, who reciprocate it, who honor it. And in those relationships, the empath discovers something they'd almost forgotten: connection isn't supposed to hurt. Love isn't supposed to cost you your peace. Care isn't supposed to leave you empty. The right people don't drain you, they energize you. They don't take without giving. They don't demand without appreciating. This discovery is the final nail in the coffin of any potential reconciliation with toxic people from the past. Because once you've tasted what healthy feels like, you can never again convince yourself that toxic is acceptable. Once you've experienced being chosen consistently, you can never again settle for being an option. Once you've been loved without conditions, you can never again accept love that comes with a price tag. The resentful empath realizes that their revenge was never about the people who hurt them facing consequences. It was about the empath finally facing the truth, that they deserved better all along. That their empathy was never the problem. That their sensitivity was never a weakness. That their capacity to love deeply was never something to be ashamed of or apologize for. The revenge is in the reclamation. Reclaiming their story from people who tried to make them the villain for having boundaries. Reclaiming their identity from people who benefited from them staying small. Reclaiming their future from a past that tried to convince them this was all they deserved. Years pass. The empath builds a life that looks nothing like the one they escaped. They're surrounded by people who celebrate them, not tolerate them. They're doing work that fulfills them, not work that drains them to fund someone else's dreams. They're living in alignment with their values instead of in constant compromise with someone else's convenience. And sometimes, late at night, they think about the people they left behind. Not with longing or regret, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Because those people taught them what they won't accept. Those relationships showed them what they're worth by showing them what they're not worth. That pain carved out space inside them that's now filled with wisdom, strength, and an unshakable sense of self. The empath doesn't wish harm on the people who harmed them. They don't need to. Because the best revenge isn't making someone regret losing you. It's building a life so authentic, so peaceful, so joyful that you forget they ever had you in the first place. It's becoming so whole that the hole they left closes completely, leaving not even a scar to mark where they once resided. The toxic people move on to new supply, new victims, new relationships that follow the same patterns. And the empath watches from a distance, if they watch at all, with something closer to pity than anger. Because the empath got out. The empath grew. The empath healed. And those people are still running the same loops, chasing the same highs, avoiding the same inner work. In the end, the empath's revenge isn't something they do to anyone. It's something they do for themselves. It's choosing themselves after years of choosing everyone else. It's protecting their peace after years of sacrificing it. It's walking away after years of staying. It's saying enough after years of saying okay. The revenge is in the living. Living freely. Living authentically. Living without the weight of someone else's dysfunction on their shoulders. Living proof that empathy doesn't equal doormat, that kindness doesn't equal weakness, that forgiveness doesn't equal reconciliation. The resentful empath transforms one final time into someone who is never really resentful at all. Just someone who is finally, beautifully, unbreakably awake. And that awakening, that clarity, that absolute refusal to ever unsee what they've seen, that's the revenge that changes everything. Not because it destroys anyone else, but because it saves the only person who ever really mattered, themselves.